So stability is often thought of in this really sort of surface level way. And oftentimes people interpret the term stability to mean, balance or not falling over or, maintaining your center of mass over one foot or both feet at the same time. And I really think that that's not a helpful way to look at stability, and I don't think it's a helpful way in application to actually train stability and what we really mean by it. So I'm going to propose that we redefine stability more so to relate to the specific forces that we're talking about in any exercise, rather than like, can I stand on a Bosu ball and do a backflip with a kettlebell, over my head kind of a thing, right? You see a lot of those circus style type exercises being done in the context of like, this is for stability, right? So when we look at stability from a structural muscular perspective, let's go over a few examples of what might actually constitute stability. So what stability might be is if I grab a weight, hold it in my hand, and I have my shoulder blade in my arm here, and obviously they're attached to my body, attached to the clavicle here. The second that I pick up that weight, right, what that weight is effectively trying to do to the shoulder girdle as a whole is trying to pull the whole shoulder girdle down, okay? And as a way effectively to deal with that downward force, I'm going to create an internal stability against that downward force with different tissues like, for instance, my levator, my upper trap, my middle trap, my serratus, all the things that are going to hold the shoulder girdle basically to the body. So I create a sense of internal stability around the actual glenohumeral joint, the scapulothoracic joint, the SC joint, to basically maintain the position of this thing that I want, right, in whatever context it happens to be, so that, right, my arm doesn't just fall off my body. And so that's one way to sort of look at it. Another way to look at it is almost from a more intramuscular perspective. So really what that means is like, okay, it was clear in the case where I held the weight and my shoulder was being pulled downward, how I had to resist that with somewhat of an upward force, like some degree of an upward force. But it becomes less clear and more difficult for people to visualize when we're actually talking about creating stability sort of in and because of ourselves, all right? So what I mean by that is like, let's imagine I'm doing a row, okay? And, my scapula, I'm sort of in this position, I'm doing this motion where I'm pulling back behind my body. My arm is gonna be sort of forward and around my body to some degree, and as I pull the arm back and the shoulder girdle sort of comes back in that sort of a retraction type motion, if we look at the forces on the scapula specifically, we could look at it on the arm, on the clavicle, whatever else, but just picking the scapula, as that scapula comes around and backward, and we'll just pick a single muscle, that rear delt, which is going to attach all along this sort of scapular spine here, is going to try to basically pull the shoulder blade down and away from the spine, right? Because it does it obviously attached to the arm, it's going to pull the arm back, but it needs an anchor point from which it's going to be able to do that. And so as the arm is moving back, the only way it actually continues to move in this direction is if the scapula is being pulled in the direction that the arm is moving. And again, the scapula can't be pulled in the direction that the arm is moving without some tissues, i.e. the middle traps, the upper traps, the levator, that want to sort of retract and elevate this thing, obviously, in addition to the rhomboids. So when we look at stability from this perspective, really what we're talking about is, okay, there's a force that's, again, an intramuscular force that's pulling the scapula this way from the rear delt. Obviously, you have teres, you have lats, you have all this other stuff that's helping out. But just to, again, pick on sort of one example, if I'm focused on, okay, where are the rear delts really trying to pull the scap? They're trying to pull it out in this way. So all the tissues that create that opposite motion, i.e. the rhomboids, the traps, the things I just went over, are going to be the things that actually stabilize the scapula in being able to maintain the appropriate scapular position that I want. This is no different in any other exercise from any other perspective, when we're talking about internal stability from the point of view of the actual intramuscular forces. Now, whether or not you need to know the specifics of the intramuscular forces, I think is not really the relevant piece. The relevant piece is that when we say stability and we talk about and try to define stability, we need to focus on specific forces and force directions, not just like, hey, is this thing that I'm holding jiggling left and right, and is it difficult to hold, right? So something I saw recently was this guy who was doing curls with I believe it was a bar, but the bar had bands looped around it, and there were kettlebells hanging from the bands, right, as he was doing the curl. Rather than just putting weight on the actual bar, to do the curls. And the rationale for the, using the former option is because it was training stability to a higher degree, but really all it's doing is it's actually just making the motion more difficult to coordinate. And so intramuscular force, because there are forces that are difficult to manage left to right, side to side, actually has to go down, right? So the output in that scenario that you're getting through your biceps is going to be lower. And because the output that you're getting through your biceps is lower, as a consequence, and ironically, all of the muscles that have to actually stabilize the glenohumeral joint in that case, right? So we could just go over the specific example that I mean here, right? So if my biceps are contracting, obviously there's all this elbow stuff going on down here. But in terms of like long head, short head, what they're actually going to do is they're actually, from the perspective of the scapula, they're going to try to some degree to pull the shoulder forward, right? You see this a lot of times in preacher curls where people are pulling up, and as they're pulling up, obviously there are inertial, considerations here, but the shoulder will kind of be pulled forward to some degree. And so because that biceps, those biceps tendons, right, one attaching here and one sort of running more up in here, want to pull that scapula sort of this way, we need tissues on the other side of the joint to resist that force to keep it where we want it. And now, whether or not thinking about where you want it is a good thing, I think is a different discussion. I think in most cases it's probably not. We're not supposed to try to manage these things. But the point just being, if you are in a position where you're trying to make an exercise more difficult through challenging stability is actually much better done when you're able to load the tissue to an appropriate and progressive manner, not where you're putting yourself in a situation where you're actually just limiting the amount of force that you can produce. Okay, because again, stability not only relates to the specific weight that you're holding and resisting the force of the weight, but also all of the intramuscular forces that you have to create to resist that weight, and then sort of a step further, all of the forces on the other side of the joint that need to be able to keep it where it's supposed to be for proper joint mechanics to occur, to make sure things like scapulas and clavicles and arms don't just fly off the body. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, that little ramble. Let me know what questions you have about this. If I could have explained anything a little bit better or more clearly, definitely ask in the comments a few specific questions if I can clarify anything. But hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully it's just a little bit of a different perspective on all this stuff, where we can move away from this like circus act type exercise stuff and move toward more specific, more stable options that actually allow for us to improve our ability to coordinate contraction and produce force.